quite a good sized group, 22 people, which is fantastic. And this morning we'll be talking about managing difficult conversations, and specifically in the context of us as sponsors and managing difficult conversations with sponsees. So just to introduce myself, I'm Naeem Uddin. I'm Director of Operational Finance at University Hospitals Sussex. I have worked in the NHS, in NHS finance my whole career, and I most of that time have worked kind of on the provider side. I've spent a little bit of time in commissioning earlier on in my career. I've always kind of engaged with the One NHS Finance, FFF kind of program, and before that FSD. So I've always kind of volunteered for things like mentoring or getting access to a mentor for myself. So I've got some experience of what I'm going to talk about. I'll give you my usual disclaimer. Some of you will have heard me say this before. I'm not necessarily an expert. I'm partly here because of my experience, and hopefully I can offer a few insights. But I think the value we'll get, and this looks like a really good group. I think the value we'll get is from a bit of active participation and hearing about your thoughts, your examples, how you've approached things. But I will start by kind of sharing a few thoughts about how I approach managing difficult conversations and some of the things I like to think about in the context of a sponsorship conversation with a sponsee. So hopefully that sounds sensible. Everybody has signed up for this morning. If you feel like you're not in the right place, feel free to drop off. But I'm just checking in the chat. Natasha has mentioned if you have access to a camera, great. If you could turn it on, that would be good as well. Great to have kind of get that interaction and that engagement, which is always slightly more difficult on Teams than it is in person, but helpful in getting a large group of people together. Any questions or any thoughts before I share a few thoughts? And what I would do, we've got up until 11 o'clock. I'm going to try and get us to finish a few minutes early so everybody can get a very short break before jumping on their next Teams call, which I'm sure lots of people will be doing. I'm very happy. I don't have any prepared. I do have a few notes and things that I will refer to. I am very happy for people to stick their hand up, and I'm looking at the screen, so very happy for people to stick their hand up and ask questions as we go. So please do jump in. All right. So I think thinking about sort of this topic, managing difficult conversations, I've sponsored 2 individuals in the last 2 or 3 years. And over the last few years, I've probably mentored quite a few people. And I think there's something about the nature of the sponsor-sponsee relationship, which is similar to the nature of a mentor-mentee relationship. And so I'm going to kind of use my experience from both of those more or less interchangeably. There are... sorry, I keep checking the chat. There are definite similarities between those relationships, and I think it's really relevant context, because in the context of giving difficult feedback or managing difficult conversations, I think it's a different kind of conversation when you're having that in an employer-employee relationship. If my line manager is giving me some feedback about the things I haven't done well, that is, I'm going to perceive that in a different way than if I was asking a sponsor or a mentor for some feedback or for some advice. And actually, I think in the context of sponsorship and in the context of being a mentor, it's a little bit easier, therefore, to give that feedback, because actually the individual has come to you for that advice, rather than, you feel like you're not doing your job well. It's a very different dynamic. So I wanted to say a couple of things about the context of the relationship. So I think that relationship is with a, you know, between sponsor and sponsee, it's built on trust, it's built on confidentiality, but it's also built on openness, and that's where it will work the best. And so hopefully you've already set the scene in that relationship, that your sponsee knows they can be open, they can talk about things that concern them, they can talk about things that they consider to be their weaknesses, and they're not concerned about you judging them or judging their performance, partly because you're not their line manager, but partly because you've kind of set the framework of the relationship, and they feel comfortable to do that. There may well be sensitive issues that a sponsee wouldn't want to raise with their sponsor, and that's fine, or there may be specific details that they wouldn't want to share for various reasons, which is also fine. But one of the things I think we all probably do, and I hope we do, and I certainly try to do, is not to kind of have any sort of judgment about the thing that my sponsee might be wanting to talk to me about. And I'll give a quick example, actually, and this comes from a conversation I once had with a mentee. And this mentee of mine actually did have a sponsor on the sponsorship scheme, and was talking about the fact that they wanted to be a CFO one day. And there was almost a kind of a challenge from the sponsor about, well, why do you want to be a CFO? And what's, you know, why do you think you've kind of got what it takes to be a CFO? And the sponsee was a bit taken aback by that, because they weren't expecting that kind of challenge. And they raised it with me as their mentor. And I did sort of reflect and think, I'm not sure it's the sponsor's job to kind of question it. I might have reservations, possibly, about whether I thought somebody had ultimately the ability to make it to a CFO role, but I'm not on the panel. I'm not making the judgment. I'm not examining their CV. I'm not trying to work out if I think they've got the right skills. My job as a sponsor is to try and help bring down the barriers, and to try and encourage, support, and enable their career progression, and rather than kind of put up artificial barriers. So I think that's really important in the sponsorship relationship, and not having that judgment is really important. So hopefully you've already established sort of the ground where the sponsee is going to feel comfortable. They're not going to feel judged. They know there's going to be confidentiality here, and in a sense that's a really high trust environment, and you've kind of built that relationship. Hopefully at the point they're coming to you for some feedback that might require a bit of a difficult conversation. I mentioned the nature of the relationship. They come to you, they've signed up for this relationship for a period of, you know, potentially 2 years, and they're coming here because they want you to help them grow. So by definition, they should be open, in theory, to hearing that feedback, to having some of those difficult conversations. And so one of the things that it's always helpful to do is to just kind of frame the feedback you're giving, especially if you think it's going to be a slightly contentious conversation, to frame it in the context of, this is about your development, and let me give you your perspective, and I'll come on to some phrases you can use to try and help that conversation as we go. Has anyone got any questions or comments just on the nature of the relationship? Has everything I said sounded sensible? Has anyone, hopefully no one's got any, is thinking this doesn't sound like my sponsor-sponsee relationship. So I think I sort of touched on this with the kind of the no judgment bit. I think one of the things that I've been challenged to do as a sponsor is to really listen actively to what my sponsee is telling me, and to kind of acknowledge to myself, and I'll find myself doing this in the middle of a session with a sponsee, kind of challenging myself to actively listen, challenging myself to hear what's really being said, and to not rush to a judgment halfway through the situation that the sponsee is telling me. Because again, it's really, I think we all do it. We all kind of start to reach conclusions about a situation or a judgment, even before the person has really finished explaining what it is. And I think so. One of the things I'm really challenging myself to do as a sponsor or as a mentor is to actively listen, to ask questions, to probe if there's something I've missed, but to kind of sit back and wait, listen, and then once I've heard the example, is to kind of also put myself in the shoes of that individual and just try and show a bit of empathy and try and understand how that has made them feel. And if I don't quite get it, I could ask, how did that make you feel? Why is this an issue? And again, trying to get it from their perspective. And that's one of the benefits, I think, as well, of being a sponsor, is that you get the perspective of people that either are not like you, whether that's because they're from sort of different protective characteristics, different backgrounds, or possibly just because after working at more senior levels, I find myself forgetting what it was like when I was a band 7 or a band 6 management accountant, trying to juggle the pressures of work and my studies and whatever other pressures you might have with family and personal life, and the pressures I face are very different to the pressures that my sponsee might be facing. And it's helpful to be reminded from time to time about what those are, because it makes me a better leader generally. So I think there are lots of advantages from that perspective. So that kind of active listening is really important, and that ability to show empathy, I think, is really important. So if you're having a conversation, we might come on to discuss some examples that those of you on the call have got. I think the most important thing about giving constructive feedback, managing some of those difficult conversations, is to frame it constructively. And it's always, whenever you're giving feedback, it's always really important to be specific, to not get into personal traits or characteristics, but to focus on behaviors, because that's something that somebody can think about, their behaviors and how they might change a particular behavior, but to be specific and to give examples of things that people might do to kind of improve. And that makes it easier for the individual to accept, rather than feel like their personality or they are personally being kind of criticized. It's to give the feedback of the positive things that they can do, actions they can take to try and improve the particular set of circumstances that they're looking for advice about. And so some of the way you can frame that is by some of it I do by saying, can I give you my perspective? Quite often I will have a mentee or a sponsee asking me questions, and it's to do with an issue they're having either with their line manager or with another senior colleague and someone who's more senior than them. And sometimes, after a bit of probing about the specifics of the situation, part of, I think, what the issue is that the sponsee doesn't necessarily have the same perspective that I would have in a more senior role. And that's partly why they have that relationship with the sponsor, is to get my perspective as a finance director or a deputy CFO. So I'm giving that observation or that advice or that feedback from my perspective as a deputy CFO. Can I share an observation from my perspective that may apply to your line manager or your senior manager that you're working with? And I'll give them the feedback about how their deputy CFO might perceive the specifics of that particular issue from their perspective. And that's quite often well received, because actually they say, yeah, you're right, I didn't think about it from that perspective, I didn't see it from that person's point of view. They're seeing it from their point of view, they've got an issue, they're looking for that feedback. It's relatively straightforward to do it, but sharing it from my perspective, sharing an observation, I'm not giving them advice, I'm sharing an observation, I'm getting them to reflect on what I'm telling them, and that's quite useful. And again, if I feel like I'm going to be having quite a difficult conversation and give some feedback, that's particularly if it's I can think of one or two times when the thing that someone has wanted to discuss with me and is a bit of a problem for them has partly involved them demonstrating some behaviors that I think probably haven't been brilliant in that situation. So I'm going to be giving them some difficult feedback about actually think about your behavior in that situation. Was that the best way to approach that particular situation? One of the things I'm going to do possibly to help soften this bit of feedback that's particularly difficult, might be difficult for them to hear, is just to again remind them about the goals of why they wanted a sponsee or sponsorship relationship or a mentor relationship, and linking it to that goal. Remember why we're having this conversation. So here's my perspective and here's what I think from my experience. And I would always slightly caveat it in that this is advice, this is what I think, this is my perspective, here's my observation, a little bit like the caveat I gave you all at the start of this call, which is I'm not necessarily an expert here. Everybody's different. Everybody has slightly different preferences. I'm giving you my thoughts and I'm giving you some examples of what I think you might do in this situation or how you might approach this particular challenge. But this is information for you to take, think about, reflect on, and find the right way forward for yourself. This isn't necessarily a definitive answer. And very often there is no single right or wrong answer for some of the challenges that your sponsee might bring to you. And I think the last thing I would say is just around trying to work through a particular problem or some feedback in a kind of collaborative way on the call. So explore the options. You can almost do a bit of mini coaching in the session, and there are times when I find the sponsor-sponsee relationship involving some coaching. And so I don't know if people would be familiar. Hopefully most of you would be familiar with the GROW model of coaching, but it's a really easy way to approach. Here's the problem, and sometimes people don't always articulate the problem brilliantly well when they've got one. But you start with the GROW model, which is to ask what the goal is. What is the issue here, and what are we trying to address? What's the reality? What are the options? And the W stands for will in the GROW model. So what are we going to do, and how are we going to take that forward? So that's one way to kind of work through what are the options that you might do here, and get the individual to reflect. That way they're going to find their own answer. You're just helping them to find their own answer rather than you suggesting or giving them feedback that they might find difficult. If they're finding their own answer, that's really, really easy in terms of them taking away what they want to do. So I think that's probably all I wanted to say for now, for the moment. I'm going to turn it over to the floor. And first of all, I'll ask, does anyone have any questions, any thoughts, any comments on anything I've said? Renali?
Yeah, thanks. And I, excuse me, I'm suffering a bit from a cold. I mean, something that I think, well, I'm having an issue with trying to performance manage somebody. It's not going well. He's had sickness to add to it. So you've got that, trying to be the compassionate person. However, there's the issue that he's not doing the job well. And when we had our away day, somebody from our learning and development came and talked about mediation. So we haven't used that yet, but I think that's something that might be worth including, is to have some sort of mediation support, because we need to work through this. And I'm having a lot of problems. I mean, the relationship is not working well. I'm one of those people who wants to maintain a good working relationship with all colleagues, because we all need to work well. We are under pressure, and yes, we're going to clash. There's always going to be clashes, but you work through a clash. But when, in my situation, I just feel that I'm trying to help, but he's not accepting that there is a problem. So I think you've got that problem as well, that causes more conflict. He's saying, no, I'm fine, and no, you're not. We're under pressure. We have to work at a certain level. So that's the challenges I'm facing, and and me trying to approach it, I'll put my hands up and say I'm hesitating because I'm thinking of his health side of it. You've got that angle, so that's why we're trying to see if we can do the mediation. I tried to ask him, oh, how did the appointment go? I don't want to talk about it. So I feel the relationship has broken down. We still got to work, and hopefully, once the mediation happens, I'm hoping there'll be some improvement.
Yeah.
Not if that's helpful to anybody, but that's my sort of angle.
Does anybody want to come in, comment, offer any advice on that point to Ronali? No, I will. So I will say. So I do think, Ronali, it's definitely more difficult in the line manager employee conversation, isn't it? Because actually, this isn't necessarily a kind of a positive conversation in the sense that you would have as a sponsee, where someone's looking for some guidance about how to progress and grow. This is a conversation where actually the individual is probably feeling relatively threatened by it's not nice when your line manager says, look, we need to have a chat about your performance. This isn't going well. And it becomes even more fraught when it's linked to illness. I think it's really helpful that your HR colleagues have kind of offered that mediation piece. I think that's really helpful. I think there's probably not much advice I can offer other than be advised, and by trust policy and by HR colleagues. And I think the point about empathy and not having judgment is to try and put yourself in that individual's perspective, which I think probably most of us can do, and to be kind about it. It's not great. There is no easy part of the conversation. There is for me, there have been times when I've been struggling in roles, when I've been struggling in jobs, and it's very easy to become defensive when you feel like you're not doing a great job, and then when someone points it out to you, nobody takes that well, right?
No.
And so there's having that empathy for that perspective. I think one of the things is, and please don't go away and say this to this individual, but there is a bit about sooner or later, if I'm really, really struggling, and I can think of a couple of times in my career where I've got to a place where I've really struggled with a role and really not enjoyed it. Sooner or later, you come around to the realization that fundamentally the role is not for you. You can try and blame your line manager, you can try and rail against the organization or the NHS or everything's broken, whatever, but fundamentally the role and the organization and the circumstances are what they are. And at some point you have to say to yourself, as the person who's feeling that challenge, this isn't going to work for me. I need to think about moving on and what else can I do? But I'm not suggesting that it's a very different dynamic as line manager.
It is.
And so stick with the policy and the process.
This is it.
Hopefully the mediation will help.
I mean, the problem is he's been around, and so many have not really performance, but try to help, and but it's the same questions coming through. But he's not gonna he's gonna put up a fight and say, no, I'm doing it. So that's you have the conflict of that angle. So it's no, but I mean, just exactly what you're saying. And I've actually been speaking to a coach, and from a non-finance, which was quite helpful. And she said, what is the end game? And I didn't think of it, but she said, can the person do it or not? And but you can't just say no, go away. You have to follow, as you say, you have to follow your trust policies. Sorry, I'm not taking everybody. I'm taking this all up. I'm going to be quiet now. But thank you, Naeem. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ronali. Gail, did you want to come in?
Hi, Naeem. Nice to see you. Yeah, I've just been sat here reflecting on. I've got a coachee and a mentee. Sorry, no, I've got a mentee and a sponsee. So I've got two different relationships, both of which are very different. And I think the point you made, which I missed the first couple of minutes, sorry, but then you've just reminded us, you just said what you said in terms of the to sort of the uniqueness of the advice that is being given, that will kind of, you have to find your own way. And also each of those relationships I have, the individuals will receive that feedback constructively given and supportively given, but in a very different way. So one of them is very introspective and very overthinks a lot and will naturally jump to a more sort of, not necessarily evidence-based, but a more uncomfortable place, regardless of the way that the feedback's delivered. But I suppose I've got to know them over the last year and a bit, so that guides the level at which I feel like, you know, how I do the conversation and how I give the feedback, just to I don't center into that space and try and work on the basis of like facts and stuff like that, as opposed to feelings. And the other one is absolutely the other way, and almost like very brave, very dynamic, very kind of extrovert, quite ambitious, and actually wants really constructive feedback, stuff that's going to push them well outside their comfort zone. And that's, so I've got both sides of that in both of mine, and that's really it's good. But I think, again, going back to the way you started, it's the uniqueness of them as individuals in the relationship, and then me, and I have to sort of flex my style with both of them to kind of to meet their needs, and it's something we do come back to in terms of, you know, whether I'm the right, because I'm possibly a little bit more on the softer side and the more empathetic side, where I'm gonna, whether the individual who's very dynamic, very ambitious, whether she wants somebody who's even more dynamic and ambitious, kind of to do that, to be that kind of push as well. But so I think that was just a really useful reflection to me, and just wondered, and just thought maybe my experience of having the two different ones might help others as well. But thank you, it's really helpful.
Thanks, Gail. I think the point, I think you've made a point really well there. I think it's, everybody's different. Everybody requires a slightly different approach, and it's that hopefully at the point you're giving that difficult feedback, it's a little bit further down the line of the relationship. You've had time to build a rapport, to build that relationship, build that confidence, and also for you to get to know the individual. Some people are very self-aware, some people are a bit less self-aware, some people, as you say, a bit more introverted, some people are a bit more expansive. So it's just bearing that in mind. Salim, did you want to come in?
Hi, Naeem. I was just trying to think about something you said in your discussions before we opened it to floor. You talked about the behaviors, but you haven't talked about the attitudes, because obviously attitudes are the internal, you know, how the person is feeling and what their beliefs are, etc. And when you talk about behavior, it's an external reaction to how they're dealing with that. And I was just wondering and trying to explore that. Is there a conscious reason for that, or is it just something that is up to the choice?
In terms of giving feedback in terms of behaviors rather than...
Yes.
I think it's partly, so the thing about attitude is, I think that's quite an internal, it's an internal personality trait, right? Some people have a positive attitude, some people have a negative attitude, some people, you might consider that some people are think about work in a really proactive way, some people are quite passive and wait to be kind of given tasks or told what to do. And I think if you're giving feedback about someone's attitude, you're giving the feedback in terms of your perception of what their attitude is, and that's a judgment, and you might get it wrong. And even if you get it right, quite difficult to say to somebody, for instance, I think the problem is you're lazy or you're not proactive. I think people here, if you said that to me, I would be closing down the conversation quite quickly, and probably you wouldn't be my mentor or my sponsor very much longer, you know. And I consider myself as someone who's relatively self-aware and someone who is all right at taking feedback. But I think most people would hear those things badly, especially if we think you're wrong. Even if 6 months later I come back and I reflect and you know what, I probably am a bit lazy and I'm a bit passive, I'm still angry at you for saying that to me. How dare you judge me in that way? So I think the thing to focus on is a behavior, because somebody can change a behavior and it doesn't sound quite so personal. And it's a little bit tricky to think about. But if you're if you think the person's attitude is that they don't connect well with colleagues, they're not very good at building rapport, let's say with budget holders, rather than saying it in that way, the thing is to say, tell me about how you meet your budget holders. Tell me about how often you meet them, or where you meet them. Do you meet them online? Do you meet them in person? And it's to think about the behaviours that they can do to help them connect more with that individual, and how they can kind of build that relationship a bit more. So I think it is just more specific in terms of thinking about the behaviors of successful people. And actually, one of the ways you can do that is to say, think about someone who's successful, someone in your sphere, maybe in your current organization or in a previous role, or maybe someone that a line manager that you aspire to be more like. What are the behaviors that they demonstrate? How do they talk to people? How do they carry themselves? How do they present themselves? And what are the things that they do, or the way that they talk to people, that you find positive, and get that individual to reflect a bit on that. And I think in that way, you're giving them some practical advice about trying to follow some behaviors that will have a positive outcome, give them something really tangible to do. Because if you just say you're a bit lazy, that's really, you need to be less lazy. I don't know how, like, what does the person do with that other than be offended? I don't know what the person does with that information. So I think that's why I sort of said, think about the behaviors. It used to be a long time ago, I've said this, a few people have probably heard me say this, when I first started my career, which feels like a long time ago now, there was a phrase which was dress for the job you want. And if I looked at my line manager, if I looked at my head of financial management, they walked around back then, a few years ago now, nobody wears ties anymore. But back then, my line manager, in fact, all of the senior managers in my organization, from the exec all the way down, everybody, all the men, obviously, which is partly why this isn't, I'll come back to why the slightly more modern version of dress for the job you want, but everyone wore suits and ties, and all the men wore suits and ties. So as a band 5, 6, 7, I wore a suit, I always wore a tie. I only stopped wearing a tie about 7 or 8 years ago. It's not just about wearing a suit and a tie, and obviously that's not very useful advice for women, but it's about the way they behaved professionally, the way they spoke to people, the way they acted, the time they turned up in the morning, the time they left in the evening, but the way they went about what they did. And it was about the behaviors that they exhibited, rather than necessarily the work they did, because quite often I'm not seeing the work that those people are doing day to day. I'm just kind of forming an impression based on the way they behaved. And if you kind of copy that, you can kind of copy some of that, not all of it, but you can kind of copy some of it, and others will see you as being the next person who's going to take over from that head of financial management. So there's something about following the behaviors of people that you consider to be successful, and trying to work out what it is they do and what it is they say that helps them be more successful, that I think can be more powerful than people realize sometimes. I think sometimes we think success and the opportunity to get the next promotion is all about how well we're doing the day-to-day of our job, and it is, because if you're not very good at your job, you are not going to get promoted. But it's also about how you're perceived by others, and some of that perception can be altered by the way you behave, by the way you speak, by the way you carry yourself, some of it by the confidence that some of those people project. And I specifically use the word project because sometimes it's not necessarily that they're naturally confident, but it's their projecting confidence, and that engages people and brings people with them, and that's why some people get to those promotion opportunities and others of us don't. So so I think the behaviours bit is really important.
Thank you.
I may have laboured that point a little bit. Anyone else got any questions or comments? Has anyone got an example of a difficult conversation that they're having? Beverly has got a comment in the chat, and Beverly's microphone is not working. Sorry, let me just read this. Do you have any advice if a difficult conversation isn't going well, and how to handle that in the moment? This is always my biggest worry going into a difficult conversation, e.g. if your perspective or feedback isn't well received. Would welcome any tips. Sorry. So Beverly, could you just clarify in the chat, is this about a line manager to employee type conversation, or is this a sponsee type conversation? Line manager. I haven't got a sponsee yet. All right, great. So so I do think it's, I mean, we talked a little bit, didn't we, with Ronali's example about the kind of there are times when a line manager conversation isn't going well. I think if it's not going well in the moment, there are times when, you know, potentially you can see that the person you're talking to and the feedback you're giving isn't being well received. Potentially they're going to get upset. That might be about you and the way you're delivering it, but it's probably not necessarily you. It's partly about the nature of the conversation, and it might be also you know, the kind of the context and the worry that they've had coming into the meeting in the first place. Worst case scenario, if a meeting goes really, really badly and someone is becoming upset, and when I say upset, I mean sad upset, could be angry upset, is to sort of put a bit of a firewall in and say, look, this is obviously, you know, becoming a little bit emotional. Why don't we just take a bit of a break, step back, let's end the meeting here, and we'll both take some time, and why don't we set up some time later in the week when we've both had a chance to reflect. There's no point kind of pushing on at that point. So that's kind of when it's got to a point where actually you probably want to bring an end to that meeting and that feedback. To be honest, there have been times when I've been talking to someone and actually they've got visibly upset, perhaps a little bit teary, but actually they haven't wanted to finish. I've suggested that we could finish the meeting. They haven't wanted to. They've wanted to carry on. They've then sort of apologized for being upset. No need to apologize for being upset. Please don't. I understand this is difficult, but let's carry on. And if that's their choice, then that's fine. You know, that hasn't made me uncomfortable, but I haven't wanted them to feel that they needed to carry on in an uncomfortable situation. And Karen is going to come in on this point, so I will let you come in, Karen.
I just wanted to share something with you that's worked really well for me this time. So I've got an issue with a member of the team just not constantly being late and wanting just wanting all their own way, wanting to do things their way, wanting to work solely, just wanting to move themselves away from the team. And I had to approach it, and I was really nervous. But the first thing I said to the employee was, just look at this, just step outside from where you're feeling at the minute and have a look at the reaction and what you're doing to the team and myself, because I have to go and report my stats and my KPIs about and I pushed it back on that person, and it really worked. So I just wanted to share that. I don't know if, you know, just to start your conversation off and say, how do you think this looks? Look at this from your point of view and give me your feedback before I give you mine. And I find that approach has always worked. I don't know if anyone finds it helpful, but I just thought I'd share it.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think what you've described is kind of getting that person to take a step back as well and see it from your perspective, or see it from the perspective of other colleagues. And actually it sounds like that's been successful. Naomi?
Hiya. I think, like Karen's just said, I think I'm somebody who is a mentee, and I turn to my mentor when I need reflection in a way that I can't make myself. But I think it's also down to having somebody or a line manager or a mentor that is open to feedback. It can actually be very difficult because there's a certain seniorness to them that therefore it can sometimes be perceived that they don't need the feedback, but it's also making sure that you have a mentor or a line manager that is open to feedback themselves. And I can find that's actually where difficult conversations can start, because you've often seen other ways of working being at a lower level that has benefited the teams in a way that someone who is senior wouldn't necessarily see because they haven't been in that role. So I think it's a two-way thing. It's not necessarily just from a higher way, it's also from a lower way as well, which I don't feel can always be as openly done sometimes as I think we'd like to think it is, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I think that's a really good bit of advice, isn't it, for all of us who are line managers or mentors or sponsors, is to absolutely try and put yourself in the shoes of the person you're talking to, and definitely see this as a two-way conversation. And I know I get a lot from my mentees or from my sponsees, and also from my team. I'm an operational DOF in a very large trust. We've got a really big senior team, and one of whom is on the call at the moment, one of the things we're going to be doing tomorrow is we're going to be talking about how actually myself and kind of CFO and my counterpart DOF for the strategic portfolio can empower our senior finance team to lead, and to, are there things I'm doing that are blocking, and do I need to get some feedback from my reports and from their reports, and all the way through the department, do we need to be better at listening? So yeah, I completely agree. I think we get the best when, as leaders, we listen, and there is something about that active listening and not rushing to judgment, actually listen to what people are telling us, and then going away and reflecting on how we can do our jobs better as well. So I think that's great advice. Thank you. The bottom-up approach has just been put in the chat. Ghazala, would you like to come in?
Hi, Naeem. Thanks for your session. Some really good, useful points there. Yeah, I think Naomi might have just started this conversation off. Some of the points I was going to mention. It was, I feel that, as a leader, whether you're a line manager or as a sponsor, I think it's important to be self-aware of your own behaviours, and just sort of, you mentioned active listening, that's really important, and also just being really aware of that, you're showing that compassion and empathy towards the whoever you're sponsoring or line managing, because sometimes you might be thinking that they're not delivering on their role, and you might be comparing them with somebody else or comparing them to yourself, but their ability might not be the same as another person. They might be at a different point in their journey. So I think it's like you have to sort of think outside that box, and sort of work with that person as well, and understand what their needs are, and sort of build that relationship first before you actually can sort of give them that feedback, so that they actually take it on board a lot better, I think. And I have actually used that approach in my own role, because I sort of joined my team at a point when CCGs had merged to become an ICB, and there were people from different teams, and they had a few bad experiences with some managers, and then when I came on board, it was like they were a bit resistant to sort of working with me, and it did take a little bit longer to get where I wanted, but my approach did actually work. So I think you just need to have a bit of patience and be a bit resilient towards that kind of a situation and towards that individual, and just find a different way of getting there.
Yeah.
So I hope that sort of helps. Yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, that's a really helpful perspective. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Be compassionate, have empathy. I think one of the words I use quite a lot, or one of the words I have in my mind when I'm trying to give feedback to people, is be kind. Just be kind. This doesn't have to be delivered in a mean way. The person's going to struggle to hear a little bit.
It doesn't cost anything, does it, to be kind?
It doesn't.
Yeah. And everybody's human. We're human as well. Just because we might be at a senior position, it doesn't mean to say that we know it all. We're always learning as well, and it's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I always like to finish the call as well, if it's just a one-off, saying, right, we've done that now, forget it, we move on, we don't have to mention it again, we start fresh today, and just forget it and never mention it again. And that builds respect, because people realise that you're not gonna, because they're gonna sit there worrying, thinking, oh, are they going to think this of me, they're going to think that of me. That kills that instantly. Just move on.
The issue's closed. That's it. We move on. Tomorrow's a new day. Clean slate tomorrow. Great. Yeah, great way to describe it. Thanks, Karen. Maria.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is important to have a mentor or oh, I think my camera is now. to have a mentor or a sponsor. They are a great help because they can advocate, or if there's any issues like around your organization or with your manager. So if you have an external mentor or sponsor, they can you can speak to them in a confidential way because they won't share the information, and they can see things from a different point of view. And if you accept, they can help you and try to smooth things around the organization. Yeah, I had an issue in my organization, and my sponsor has been great, and he saw the situation in completely different way from my point of view and from the point of view one of my managers. And yeah, and he smoothed out completely the situation, and we are in a very good situation now. So that helps a lot if you can do that.
Yeah, I think that's the value a lot of people get from having that sponsorship relationship or a mentor as well. Jeff.
Hi, Naeem. I'm just sort of following up on what Gonzalo said. Having 2 sponsees and various mentees, I invest all of my time and energy to get background of where my sponsees are in life, not just necessarily at work, and get a real and build on that relationship. So my initial meetings with sponsees are always about establishing a robust relationship where they understand that the dedicated time that we have, they can use to discuss anything, not just maybe about work, could be about anything. But I have one sponsee with health issues, so you take that into consideration. I've been very fortunate that I've never had with the sponsees difficult conversations. Line manager, completely different. You get those. In my case, it happened to be on a regular basis, which was quite hard. But I think that what I'm trying to say is that from a sponsee's perspective, the sponsees invest their time. They're there for support. Be accessible, and if there are elements that a sponsee feels as though they can't go to their line manager, they know that they have their sponsor to hand, and that's one of the things that I've really emphasised. Especially if I haven't spoken to them for some time. I met one of my sponsees at the summit last week. I hadn't seen for ages, and he said, "I'm really sorry, Jeff, I've been too busy." I said, no, it's entirely up to you. You run with this, but you know where I am. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think the thing that the thing that resonates from that is that it's that building of the relationship and having that relationship that's so important. And I think that kind of goes for work relationships in general, doesn't it? You know, I spend a fair amount of my time, or certainly I have done in my career as a sort of a finance business partner, and that's been a lot of my career, when I'm trying to convince budget holders, general managers, clinicians that they've got to save significant parts of their budget, or they've got to improve productivity, or they've got to make cuts. The fact that I've established a good working relationship with those individuals has made those difficult conversations a bit easier. The fact that you understand the context of the broader context of the lives of your sponsees, of your mentees, helps you put the advice into that context and makes it easier to have some compassion for the background circumstance. Quite interesting that you haven't had to give, maybe it hasn't had difficult conversations, but I've certainly given feedback, and I've been specifically asked for feedback where from sponsees and mentees, where some of the feedback has been, here are the things I think you could do to improve this. Here are the steps I think you could do to go about this. And certainly here's an observation from my perspective as a deputy CFO or director of finance. Here's my perspective, and here's how I view that when a member of my team has come to me, and in kind of holding up a bit of a mirror it's that thing of encouraging the individual to kind of see it from my perspective a little bit as well. And I think that's sort of what Karen was saying with the difficult conversation she had. There is a bit of some, I mean, it's slightly different. If it's a performance conversation between a line manager and a member of staff, they're not really coming to me for advice about how they improve. They're feeling possibly a bit defensive about the situation they're finding themselves in, and that's partly why it's difficult to give them that feedback. In the context of sponsors and sponsees or mentors, it's slightly different conversation because they're actively coming to you for some advice with a particular problem. That's,
yeah, they're different arenas, aren't they, Naeem? You know, line manager and I'll use the word subordinate is different to sponsor, sponsee, and mentor and mentee. So sometimes it's difficult. Senior managers, you have to remember which forum you're actually sitting in and not get that conflict and remain as professional as possible, especially from the line manager perspective.
Especially, I mean, from all perspectives as well. I wouldn't want to be unprofessional, but it's a different relationship dynamic.
Yeah.
When it's not somebody who works for you. And actually, one thing we haven't picked up on is my sponsees, and I think possibly for lots of people, my sponsees have been outside of my organization, and actually they've been outside of my system as well. So they've not been close to me and the routine work I do. It's entirely possible that you might have a sponsee within your own organization, or certainly within your system, that you are a bit more closely aligned. Your day jobs are a bit more closely aligned, and that might be, that might add a further level of not quite complexity, but it becomes a bit more complex if somebody's within my organization and they are my sponsee. My advice for mentors and mentees has always been over the years, have a mentor who's outside of your organization, or certainly outside of your line. So if there are, and it partly depends on what you would want to think about. If you're a mentee, I want to work on my development in this field. It's not a conversation I want to have with my line manager. I want to have it with someone who's not connected with my day job. But all of these things play into, the context of the feedback that you might be giving. Anyone else got any questions or queries? I think we've got a minute or two if we do. But if not, we might wrap it up there. I will say thank you very much. That's been a really active and helpful discussion. Hopefully we've all got something from it. I've definitely got something from it. It's definitely made me think about the way I give feedback and the way I manage some of these conversations, and helpful to share perspectives. Natasha, am I handing over to you for the final word?
Yeah, although I haven't really got many words to say, but thank you so much for your session, Naeem. It's been really helpful, and to have everyone else engaged too. I guess 5 minutes back in the diary to grab a quick drink for any other meetings. Thanks again, Naeem, and thanks everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks
Really
so much.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.